If you're watching this video, I'm gonna assume you're the kind of person who likes to learn, and if you do, I would highly suggest CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription service that's all about widening our understanding of this world. With thousands and thousands of titles, you're sure to find something that'll make you think and keep you entertained. If you like true crime and badass women, you're gonna love Murder, She Solved, a series about female crime investigators solving cases that no one else could. Right now, if you sign up for CuriosityStream, you can get an annual discount, and CuriosityStream also comes bundled with Nebula, which is an amazing subscription service for independent creators just like me. All you have to do to get this great deal is go to curiositystream.com/katblaque and put in the code katblaque in checkout, and you can get both CuriosityStream and Nebula. Anyway, let's get into this conversation. Can we talk about something? So recently I did a video where I watched and responded to Dave Chappelle's newest show called The Closer, and I had a lot of things that I wanted to share with you guys after meditating on it for a couple of days. First of all, I want to start out by reiterating that I did not find Dave Chappelle's special to be particularly offensive to me. I love offensive humor. I have a pretty dark sense of humor, and a lot of you guys told me that you were pretty disappointed in me laughing at certain jokes because of that. I can't really make this conversation about how much what he said offended me personally, because it honestly just didn't. Could I have sat there and criticized every little joke? Abso-fucking-lutely. But at the end of the day, for me in general, even when it comes to the trans jokes, it's really not that deep for me personally. However, the reason why I'm making this video is because it's pretty clear to me that a lot of you guys can't figure out if Dave Chappelle is a truth teller that we should be listening to or a jokester that we shouldn't be taking seriously. A lot of you guys seem to agree with some of the sentiments expressed in his special, and as long as people feel that way and defend his points as though they are valid, I'm gonna be here to criticize those ideas. Now, at the top of this video, I'm just gonna flip right to the conclusion that I think a lot of you guys have reached, and let me know if I'm wrong. Defenders of Dave Chappelle seem to want to live in a world where people are allowed to publicly malign gay and transgender people without any repercussion and be paid handsomely while doing so. Additionally, they see expressions of homophobia and transphobia as central to the Black male experience, and any criticism of that is anti-Blackness. Now, let me know if that's the wrong impression, but that's what I get after reading some of the comments. As I said in my video, these arguments feel like an avoidance of accountability. And to me, that's very, very interesting in the context of a comedy special that concludes with this idea that transgender people who were critical of him are responsible for the death of his token trans friend whose suicide he describes as masculine. Now, I will return to Dave's token trans friend, but before I do, I wanted to criticize the overall argument made throughout the special. Now, Dave's main argument is that Black folks have not been able to harness the power of cancellation in the same way that trans or LGBTQIA+ folks have been able to. And as a Black trans woman who has sat through, sometimes even hosted, several conversations about our ever-changing ideas around racism in this country, I'm honestly having a really hard time following that thought process. One of the comments that I got summarizes this sentiment pretty clearly. He pointed out that the LGBT community acts as if it's them against the world and they have it so hard, but as soon as anybody says anything that even sounds like it could be against gay people, even if it isn't, everyone is against them and wants to take their shoes away. Now, I think he meant shows away, but you get the point. He continues to say that gay people are the only people you'd have to leave a disclaimer about, like, not because they're gay or not that I'm homophobic. But you know, I don't know if it's because of the spaces that I socialize in, but ever since the popularity of Black Lives Matter, I feel like a lot of white people very much do feel that way. In this new atmosphere, a lot of white people are terrified of saying something that could be potentially seen as racist. I've had many of my white acquaintances tiptoe around conversations about race because they are absolutely terrified of saying the wrong thing and potentially being ruined. In the past few years, we've seen a lot of examples of white people losing their jobs and opportunities because they expressed racism privately or publicly. Last year, I made a video about racist TikToks, and one of the videos was a young woman and her boyfriend making a joke that included the N-word. When this video went viral, Black people found it, tracked her down, figured out what school she just got into, contacted her school, and had her scholarship completely revoked. And she will now forever be known as that girl who made a racist TikTok video with her boyfriend. And well, they were just joking. They were just having a good time making fun of Black folks, and you sensitive ass Black people had to track her down, figure out where she lived, and ruin her life, all because you couldn't take a goddamn joke. Now, I don't know if it was clear, but I am obviously joking. But if I wasn't and I was trying to express empathy and support for this racist white woman who lost her job, a lot of y'all would call me an Uncle Tom. Personally, I think a racist deserves to lose their job or their scholarships or any opportunities, especially if they were dumb enough to post it on social media. I say all that to say that it's very, very hard for me to see Dave Chappelle's argument as valid at this particular point in the timeline where the world is rightfully so rallying behind Black Lives Matter. Now, don't get me wrong, we have a really, really far way to go before racism is fully understood and defeated in this country. But I have never seen as many people rally behind the violence against trans people as they do the violence against unarmed Black men. And by the way, 2021 is on track for becoming the most dangerous year for transgender people. Trans murders are at an all-time high. As transgender visibility has increased, so has the violence against us. And like I said in my first video, I have a lot of pessimism around transgender acceptance. You guys have to remember that I transitioned 16 years ago. And I think that what a lot of people are reacting to is the fact that some of y'all were able to ignore the fact that we existed not even that long ago. And now you keep seeing examples of us in the media, and you're kind of forced to acknowledge our existence in a way that you weren't 10 years ago. For many people, Caitlyn Jenner was the first transgender person they've ever seen, and that's why so much ire is directed towards her, even though she doesn't at all come close to representing the average trans person. You conflate the media circus around transgender people with support, but the material reality is that in so many ways, transgender people have never been under a more intense microscope in my lifetime. For me, what this means is that forever ago, transgender people were kind of able to sort of fly under the radar, disappear within their gender, and not really deal with all of the current discourse. Now you have a situation where people are actively attempting to legislate against transgender people because their reaction to transgender visibility is we need to make it harder for trans people to participate in public life. Have things gotten better for trans people in some ways? Absolutely. I would never deny that. And of course, there are so many other places in the world where being transgender is a lot harder. But like I said, with visibility has come violence. And unfortunately, most of the trans women who are murdered look like me. And most of the people who murder them look like Dave Chappelle. Part of why I'm entertaining this conversation is because I do, to some degree, think that Dave is a bit ignorant and short-sighted. Dave's evolving feelings around transgender people feel very realistic to me, especially in the way that he interacts with the character Daphne that he discusses in his special, who is, of course, a transgender woman who is his biggest fan. People who are working through their biases are more likely to engage with people who comfort them but don't challenge them. It also makes sense to me that an audience that is on the fence about transgender acceptance would also find this character to be identifiable. Now, the reason why I'm referring to Daphne as a character is because there's a very particular image of her that's drawn up through his special. He builds up this character who, unlike other transgender women in the special, is patient with him. She's willing to stand on the stage and deal with being heckled. She was applauded for relinquishing aspects of her gender for humor, and apparently, according to Dave Chappelle, would laugh at a joke that would describe her suicide as masculine. Dave is very deliberate in the way that he describes the transgender people who criticize him. He describes them as this sort of angry mob out for blood. And when Daphne defends him, he says that this same angry mob harassed her and eventually pushed her to suicide. He says that it's possible that there were other issues, but ultimately the audience is left to feel as though transgender people who criticized him certainly had a hand in her death. He says that unlike the trans community, he decided to support her after her death by setting up a grant in her daughter's name. And this is supposed to be the thing that makes him seem like the hero in the story. The stories that he tells about Daphne are there to give you the impression that he was incredibly close to her, and that relationship is supposed to stand against all of the criticism levied against him of transphobia. How possibly could he have been transphobic? He's got a trans friend. But this story is just that, a story. It isn't reality. In reality, even if we go by what Dave said in his special, he had no clue that Daphne had a daughter until he read her obituary, which is a very strange thing for him not to know if they were close. This trust was set up just this past summer, and people who know Daphne said that Dave didn't reach out for years after she died. Additionally, it's incredibly hard to find proof of this unhinged, crazy, angry transgender mob that was harassing Daphne. At the time of Daphne's death, there were only 9 replies under the tweet that she wrote in defense of Dave Chappelle, and the vast majority of the responses were positive. But this doesn't mean that there wasn't friction on her timeline. When Sticks and Stones first came out, Daphne would do a lot of searching of her own name, and she would find several people who were openly criticizing Dave for how he used Daphne in his show. While these interactions were not always positive, it's a pretty far cry from the narrative that a transgender mob harassed her to the point where she killed herself. Her sister, Becky, would tweet that she did not kill herself because of bullying, but rather because of PTSD. Apparently, Daphne had a lot of struggles. She had not too long ago gone through a really intense divorce, she lost her job, she lost custody of her children, and she experienced relentless transphobic harassment on the streets of San Francisco. Now, I am not going to doubt that it's possible that someone trans said something critical in response to her post about Dave Chappelle. And no one knows better than I do that sometimes it really only takes that one message to hurt you. But I think that it's worth pointing out that Dave attributing her death to transgender people who were criticizing him was very, very purposeful. And it served to reinforce the narrative that he was painting about the transgender people criticizing him as having the power to, as he says, punch down on comedians who may or may not make jokes that lean into transphobia. I do actually believe to some degree that Dave's relationship with Daphne might have very well been responsible for his shift in his understanding of transgender experiences. But I can also see that he very clearly used her and her death as a shield against criticism, which sounds familiar to me as a Black person. It sounds like a white person who has a Black friend saying, well, I've got a Black friend, as a response to the accusation that they might have said something racist. His audience will cite this friendship as a defense against the accusations of transphobia, and I'm just wanting to point out that that is incredibly purposeful. Now, on the flip side, Dave says very clearly and very loudly that he is Team TERF. And maybe I shouldn't, but I'm going to give Dave a bit of grace here because I'm going to assume that he probably doesn't know how vicious a lot of TERF rhetoric is and why so many transgender people, upon hearing that, felt a certain type of way about it. For example, recently the BBC published an article about lesbians being pressured into having sex with transgender women. And in this article, they cited a lesbian sex worker by the name of Lily Cade. Lily Cade is somebody who a lot of transgender people would describe as a TERF, and she posted these things, and I'm going to warn you, this is pretty intense. These comments are quite hurtful. I will put a timestamp if you want to jump ahead, but I'm going to read them out to you guys just so you kind of understand what a lot of people think of when they hear the word TERF. The post says, "Trans women are men. Trans women are the weakest, vilest, most pathetic men on earth. Too weak to even kill themselves, rather than control the horrifying shadow monster they are, grooming your children to serve. The ones who kill themselves are the strong ones. Weak men serve the Dark Lord because it's the path of least resistance." In a follow-up post, she calls for the lynching of specific trans women. If you left it up to me, I'd execute every last one of them personally. Cancel the ever-loving fuck out of this. Cancel this so hard that no man dare walk the path of the trans woman in public ever again. Enough is enough. Lynch Caitlyn. Lynch the sisters Wachowski. Lynch Lauren Hubbard. Lynch Fallon Fox. Make these men stand up as men you all know they are and hold them accountable for their shame. She had this to say about the mother of Jazz Jennings, who is a transgender girl who has a reality TV show about her life. How was this woman allowed to raise children? This woman sins against the law of God, against the law of nature, against the sacred duty of motherhood, against her own bloodline, for attention. How many other little kids were chopped up because of this bitch? Hang this bitch. Gang rape this bitch before you hang her. How dare she sacrifice her own child to the cult for fame? Scum-sucking, dog cum guzzling, shit-eating, lower than a worm, hellfire, monster of a woman. How could you put this on TV? Why haven't you killed these people? Why haven't you killed the addiction that has made many of them your lords and masters? What are you afraid of? Faggots, children, catching a cold? This is the softest pedophile cult that has ever existed, and it's brought your culture to its knees. Now, I can understand how people who are not very familiar with TERF rhetoric could listen to how Dave Chappelle describes it and sort of see it as not as intense as the stuff that I just read. But when most transgender people talk about TERFs and think about TERFs and how they feel, this is what they're thinking about. And that's why so many transgender people were upset when he publicly aligned himself with TERF ideology. Because when we think of TERFs, we think of this stuff. We don't think of just baseline acknowledgments of biology. It's worth mentioning that ironically, Lily Cade, who was cited in an article that theoretically is about protecting women, also has several sexual assault accounts against her from women. And I think this is a great example of why I take such an issue with Dave and other people framing transgender people as overtly privileged on the basis of their transness. In reality, the narrative around who transgender people are is constantly being controlled by people who are not transgender. Most of us spend years and years in our life begging cis people to give us access to public life so that we can function in the way that most people do in this society. We want to work, we want to be able to live, we want to be able to have homes and go to school. We want basic things. And most of us are having to fight constantly against the incredibly negative narratives projected onto us because we're transgender. And we painstakingly devote so much time into attempting to flip these negative images that people have in their minds instead of just being taken for who we are. Lily Cade was able to be cited in an article about violence against women while having a long history of violence against women. And I think that says a lot, doesn't it? It's almost like this isn't a conversation about protecting women from sexual assault as much as it is a conversation about assigning predatory behavior to trans women. Now, I'm not going to talk about this full article. Sean actually made a really, really great video about it. You should go check that out over here. But it's worth mentioning that this article actually has very, very little evidence of this being a trend. And yet people still eagerly bought into that narrative. And to me, that is the precise issue at hand. Dave Chappelle very carefully crafted this narrative of this angry transgender mob that relentlessly bullied the one transgender woman who publicly defended him until she killed herself. And even though there was very little evidence of this, people still believed it. I'm aware of the fact that one of the things that makes this conversation so confusing to people who are not so familiar with these conversations is that what is and isn't transphobia is often debated. But I just want to say that to me, there's no purer form of transphobia than assigning malice and predation to transgender women because they're transgender. I had people in the comment section of my last video yelling at me because they said that I was part of the transgender mob that pushed Daphne to kill herself. And in that same video, I stated that I have never even seen Dave Chappelle's first special. I don't know what he said. I still don't know. I've never even heard of Daphne until I watched that special. And I found out more about her since researching for this video. But even still, people were willing to believe that I was part of this mob simply because I was criticizing Dave Chappelle. That I even have to say that and yet have so many people confidently believe otherwise is, I think, a really, really great example of how we really don't live in this overly trans affirmative society. When we speak about transphobia, we're largely speaking about this bias that seeks to absolutely limit transgender people's access to public life. And this is not too different from the conversations we have about racism. Dave Chappelle is a Black man in America who has to be very, very aware of the fact that a lot of people look at Black men and they see a scary, violent criminal. This is in fact the same exact thing that we're protesting against when we march on the streets for unarmed Black men and scream Black Lives Matter. And yet, whether or not he fully understands that he's doing this, he does indeed reinforce a similar bias against transgender women. Now, as I said at the top of my last video, I don't care about Dave Chappelle. I really don't care. I really don't think it's that deep. I genuinely think that we have deeper and bigger fish to fry. However, while I'm not personally offended, it's very clear to me that a lot of people take his jokes as gospel. And that's why I believe this conversation is so important, because regardless of the victimhood that Dave Chappelle paints himself with, he is still incredibly influential. And the discourse around his special has indeed encouraged a lot of people to feel emboldened in their transphobia. Dave is very right to point out that it's possible for somebody to be LGBT and also racist. Being queer does not alleviate you from being anti-Black. And as a Black transgender woman who's experienced racism at the hands of white queer folks, I will never deny that. But what I want for everyone to understand is that what you're digesting as the privilege and influence of queer folks is really just a shock to an increase in queer visibility and a newer trend of LGBT allyship being a cornerstone of some corporations' public image. Like I said, these conversations often just feel like people complaining that they can't be homophobic or transphobic in public anymore without repercussion. In Dave Chappelle's case, I'm really still stuck on the fact that he's a millionaire who is richer than I will ever be, is richer than most transgender people will ever be, who ultimately has the support of Netflix no matter how many people have tried to get his special removed. But apparently all of that is contradicted because Caitlyn Jenner did a Vanity Fair photo shoot 6 years ago. Dave Chappelle has over-dramatized the criticism that he's gotten, and a lot of people have fallen for it. And to be honest, it's really hard for me to hold this image up of a man who is apparently so badass and will tell it like it is, and he doesn't care what other people have to say because he's going to tell it like it is, against this image of this man who victimizes himself over the slightest criticism to the point where he has to mythologize a person who he actually knew to defend himself against criticism. I've said this a lot on my channel because I've been making videos about being transgender for 16 years, but at this particular point in my life, I could go all day long without ever discussing transness. And this is the only platform and context in which I find myself actively discussing that I'm transgender. And I only have these conversations because I feel like there's so many things that are misunderstood, and I get kind of frustrated with the fact that a lot of people don't sort of see these things as clearly as I do. These conversations are often incredibly disempowering because in this current society as it stands, transgender people are not seen as the faithful narrators of their own life and experiences. It doesn't matter how wrong a cis person's recitation of my life might be, that will always be trusted and believed more than my straight-faced, recitation of my own life. That is the uphill battle that most trans people are facing. And that is very, very frustrating. And that's why I have so many of these conversations. I know that there's a lot of people watching this video because they would like to sort of understand more about who transgender people are. And I think YouTube is an amazing place to start. There are so many transgender people speaking about their life and experiences that if you are very curious, you can find them if you would like to hear them. I want to encourage people to listen to transgender people speak about their own experiences with oppression, because half of the stuff that cis people seem to think is silly that transgender people apparently care about, I would say most trans people don't care about. You're probably always going to miss the mark when you try to characterize all transgender people as having one way of thinking, because like most minorities, we are incredibly diverse. And I would just encourage people to seek out those perspectives instead of trusting just a cis person's narration of who transgender people are. I think it's really important to understand that in a society that punishes transgender people for transitioning, that there are always going to be transgender people who attempt to make themselves more tolerable to people who don't like them. That's survival for a lot of us, but it does not erase the system that puts us in that position in the first place. Anyway, let me know what you guys had to say about this video. I would love to hear your thoughts. A lot of really thoughtful conversations were had in the last video, so let's keep having them here. Anyway, hopefully this is the last time I talk about Dave Chappelle, unless you guys want me to watch the first special. So let me know how you guys feel in the comment box below. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.